Whilst most of the main races that exist within the fantasy side of Warhammer also exist in some form or another within Warhammer 40k, Skaven are the exception to this. But in a universe of abhumans and mutants, a race of humanoid rats doesn't seem so far-fetched. I'm Pete the Wargamer, and in this video I'll be showing you how to kitbash Space Skaven. I began with the Genestealer Cult Acolyte set. Now I could have dipped into some third-party components here, particularly those from Mantic Games via Min-Range. However, I wanted to keep this particular conversion to using only Games Workshop components. So I started by removing and cleaning the components required to build the torso and legs of a Genestealer Cult Acolyte. The Genestealer cults are probably the closest Skaven equivalent in Warhammer 40k, which meant I could borrow some of their aesthetics. The Acolytes are the closest to the traditional Skaven style. They are hunched and have clawed feet, which were perfect for representing the iconic Ratmen. However, the problem I had was with the segmented carapace armour. The more Genestealer-like aspects of the Acolytes needed to be removed to help the model better represent a Skaven-like creature. For the legs, I need to remove the rigid transition between the shin and the foot. To remove this, I started by trimming away the bulk of the raised carapace with my knife, before continuing to smooth it out. I continued working away until I was left with a flattened out transition between the lower leg and the foot, resulting in a much more Skaven-like foot and leg. The next problem I faced was the distinct lack of fur. Genestealer cults are markedly hairless, so to truly represent the small fuzzy ones, I needed to get sculpting. I started out with my sculpting medium of choice, Procreate. It's very similar to green stuff, but it's grey. It's a little less sticky too, and I find it personally easy to work with, but either can be used here. I started by mixing the two colours together until I had a consistent grey. With the putty mixed, I tore away a small amount and pressed it into a rough disc shape, about a couple of millimeters across. This was then pressed onto the back of the calf before being pressed around to follow the contours of the leg. With the putty in place, I could begin to create the fur. I used a sharp edge tool to scour a series of vertical lines. I started at the bottom, creating a row of lines before moving upwards. This was continued until the whole patch of fur was completed. As the rows moved upwards, the lines would overlap those on the row below, creating the impression of strands of fur laying on top of the others. By moving the strands around with my tool, I was able to create a less uniform result, which helped with the realism. I then repeated the process on the other leg. Combined with the removal of the carapace and the clawed feet, the result was a very Skaven-like leg. With the legs completed, I could start on the arms. Now the Acolytes feature 3 arms, which, while they could make for an interesting clan molder-like mutation, I ultimately chose not to use them. This was mainly because the arms are quite a bit longer in relation to the rest of the body, and they would require a lot of extra work to remove the carapace. However, I wouldn't need to look too far for alternatives. I chose to use some of the arms from the Genestealer Cult Neophytes kit. However, when I compared the arms to the torso, I could see that due to the variation in torso width, the arms wouldn't fit perfectly. I started off by gluing the right arm into place. This would serve as an anchor point and give me a good idea of what adjustments I would need to make to the left arm in order for it to fit. I trimmed the left shoulder so that the arm sat a little closer to the body to counteract the wider torso. I made a few comparisons to ensure that the fit was correct before gluing the left arm into place as well. Now that the arms were in place, I could begin to add fur to those too. This followed the same process as before. I mixed up some Procreate, cut it down into a smaller size and pressed it into the gap between the forearm wraps and the sleeves. I once again used my sculpting tool to add the fur effects, creating a series of layered lines to build up that realism. At this stage I had my arms, torso and legs, but I was missing a key ratty feature, a tail. The most obvious way to acquire one of these would have been simply to cut one away from an existing Skaven set, but rat tails are surprisingly simple to create, provided you have the right tools for the job. I started out by rolling some more Procreate into a long, thin sausage that tapered off towards the end. I then grabbed my pipe tool. This one was from Mask Mini, but these seem to be no longer available. Luckily, Green Stuff World has a very similar tool that will give you a very similar result. I laid my putty sausage perpendicular across the ridges of one plate and then lined up the top plate above it, pressing the two plates together ever so slightly whilst moving the top plate side to side, following the line of the ridges. Now it's helpful to use some water or a Vaseline-like product here to prevent the plates from sticking to your putty. This action resulted in a series of segments being formed, creating the appearance of a rat-like tail. I bent around the tip to create a slight curve and left the putty to fully cure overnight. Once the putty had cured, I went ahead and compared the tail against the back of the Skaven. This gave me an idea as to how much I needed to trim the length, which was done with my clippers. With the tail ready, I went ahead and glued it into place using some super glue. The only remaining anatomical part to add at this stage was the head. There are a couple of good sources for these, such as plague monks and storm vermin. Regular clan rats have heads sculpted to their bodies, so they are trickier to use. I personally opted to use this gas mask head that I found within the Plague Claw set to help round out that sci-fi theme. While this head didn't have a ball socket, I was able to glue it into place without much trouble. My final step in building this conversion was to add a little warp stone to help tie this guy back into the fantasy Skaven. Rather than taking this from another kit, I instead chose to carve out my piece. I grabbed a leftover piece of sprue and used my scalpel to whittle out a rough crystalline shape. I started in one direction before flipping the piece around and completing the crystalline shard. I sawed this away from the rest of the sprue before cleaning things up a bit, which left me with a rough piece of warpstone. To attach this warpstone to the Skaven, I turned to my ever useful chain. I used some super glue to fix one end of the chain to the back of the right shoulder and gave this a few moments to dry. I could then pull the chain across the Skaven's back. This gave me the length I needed, and so I could use my clippers to trim the chain to length and then glue this end into place just below the left shoulder. I couldn't leave the chain as it is though. It was much too loose and it would make painting it that much more difficult. So I again applied some more super glue across the length of the chain to help fix it into place. With this done, I could bring in my warpstone shard and attach this in such a way that made it look like it was hanging from the chain. And that concluded the creation of this Space Skaven conversion. All that's left to do was to give him a base and a suitable paint job. And here we have my completed take on the Skaven in 40k. I gave him a suitably grimy and rusty appearance with a scrap heap base to match. I then used some focus points of bright green to really help some of the details to stand out. As I mentioned, there are other manufacturers that make similar styled miniatures, but building something using purely Games Workshop kits was a fun challenge, and the result is something that would still be perfectly legal to use in any tournament as well. If the rules for them existed, of course. So if you enjoyed the Xenos style conversion, then please do let me know, along with any other ideas you might have for other distinctly non-Space Marine conversions you would like to see me tackle in the future. So, the final thing to say is a massive thank you to all of my supporters. Whether you support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, or you just use my affiliates links, your help is what keeps this channel alive, and it's what allows me to build these conversions for you. If you would like to help me out, then you can check out my description for all the relevant links. And so until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.